Hello and welcome to Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai International Lit Fest, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. This session is presented by Kotak. There will be a short Q&A at the end of the session, so please send in your questions in the comments section. In his book Humankind, historian and best-selling author Rutger Bregman argues that people are inherently good and cooperative, challenging the age-old notion that humans are selfish by nature. Today, he discusses the ideas he puts forth in Humankind with George Jose, visiting associate professor of anthropology at NYU Abu Dhabi. And now, survival of the friendliest. Over to Mr. Bregman and Dr. Jose.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here talking to you, Rutger. I really enjoyed reading two of your works, Humankind, A Hopeful History, and Utopia for Realists, How We Can Build the Ideal World. So I was wondering, Rutger, if we could begin the conversation by you giving us a sense of, the overarching concerns that actually inform your work. What is it that drives you? What is it that makes you write these two works and also the history of progress before that?
I love that question. And yeah, thanks so much for doing this as well, by the way. When I started working on Utopia for Realists, my first book that was translated in other languages, it's quite a while ago now. It was 2012, 2013. And the one thing that I was fascinated by was the process in which unreasonable ideas become reasonable, in which total fantasies become reality, right? How we move from utopia to reality. That's the thing I've always been fascinated by. How does that work? And it seemed to me at the time, almost 10 years ago, that the big problem of my generation was not that we didn't have it good. And of course, I'm specifically talking about, rich white kids in the Netherlands like me. Not that we didn't have it good, but that we didn't have a vision of where we wanted to go. What's next after you achieve, a welfare state, democracy, equal rights for men and women. Sort of what are the big utopias for the future? And so that is the overarching theme of all of my writing, I think, is how do we create utopia? How do we get there? And Humankind really developed out of that, because I realized that we need a different view of human nature, of who we are as a species, if we actually want to get to utopia.
And would you say, Rutger, that these ideas, especially about the utopia, have become kind of unfashionable? Are these ideas a bit on its back foot, so to speak, in our world today? Do you see yourself as battling for a set of ideas that are not quite the reigning ideas of our time?
Well, that was certainly the case 8-9 years ago. So when I first wrote about something like universal basic income, for example, this crazy notion of giving people just money, to abolish poverty. The idea is in fact quite old, as you know. It goes back at least 200 years, but 10 years ago it was pretty much forgotten. So I started writing about it, and very few people took it seriously at the time. That has changed a lot, actually. Nowadays, basic income pilots and programs are spreading around the world like wildfire. Just this week was in the news that Chicago is going to implement another big basic income pilot, where they're going to give basically free money to 5,000 families. If you would have told me that 10 years ago, I would have said you're crazy. Surely that's not going to happen. So I've been astounded by the speed of change. And I think you could even argue that we're now moving into a different era. It wouldn't surprise me if historians will look back at 2020, at the impact of the pandemic, and say, well, that was the shifting point. That was the breaking point. That was when neoliberalism, this ideology that has reigned for at least 40 years, when the era of neoliberalism ended and we moved into a different era.
That's universal basic income, and clearly I've seen both the YouTube videos of you speaking about that theme, and indeed I think a couple of days ago, or probably was it yesterday, when you tweeted about the fact that there's an increasing acceptance of this idea. And as you say, I mean, even up to a decade ago, it was probably a revolutionary idea. People would have said, how bizarre and so on.
Yeah.
But
there are many more examples. So
Uh-huh.
if you look at what's happening in the United States right now,
Mm-hmm.
when Joe Biden announced
Yes.
his candidacy for president of the United States, to be honest, I wasn't very enthusiastic. I thought that he was just going to be another middle of the road Democrat, another boring centrist that was not going to, live up to the challenges of our time.
Mm-hmm.
So I was quite pessimistic about that. And I was also quite pessimistic when he actually won the presidency. I am happy to admit that I was completely, utterly, totally wrong about that. Because if you see what the Biden administration has been doing, in the last couple of months or ever since they started, it's been pretty astounding, actually. Just one example, they have now this child allowance, basically free money for families with children. And the estimates are that it has halved child poverty in the United States. That is pretty historic, if you ask me. What the Senate Democrats are now working on is a pretty ambitious plan to tax billionaires, right? Again, it would be absolutely historic if it would pass Congress. If you would have told me just 5 years ago that this was going to happen, that these ideas would be taken seriously on the Senate floor in the United States, well, I wouldn't have believed that. But here we are. So obviously, we have a very, very long way to go, and especially when it comes to things like climate change. I mean, there's more enough reason to be very, very anxious. But I think we can now clearly say that there are many, many signs that we are moving into a new political era.
No, you're right. I mean, I think we are in the middle of a kind of a churn. I think you can see a certain kind of dynamism to different kinds of ideas, wrestling with each other. But I just want to push you a little bit on this idea itself, Rutger, of the universal basic income and ideas of that nature, right? Because there is also a sense in which we see a kind of pervasive disenfranchisement of people, right? I mean, there are more people who are considered illegal, who are probably not in a position to claim any kind of, demand any kind of rights. Whether it's because of immigration, whether it's because of the ways in which governments are no longer looking to kind of actually address their citizens as rights-bearing citizens, right? So even when the idea of universal basic income is expanding, if one were to expect that to be doing that, the potential group of people being left out, even of that idea, also seems to be expanding.
Yes. So I think you're absolutely right. But I think that criticism is not specific to basic income. It basically holds for the whole welfare state, right? If you look at European welfare states, for example, which are internationally quite generous, right? So here in the Netherlands, we get really good universal healthcare, heavily subsidized childcare, high quality schooling, etc., etc. So just having a Dutch passport is worth, a lot of money. But we all know that it's really hard to get into the Netherlands, right? And we all know how we treat refugees at the border in Greece, right? Terrible abuses of human rights are happening over there. So indeed, as those welfare states become stronger, sometimes it also seems to be the case that the walls around it become higher and higher and higher. And that's why, one of the last chapters of Utopia for Realists, my first book, was about a much more radical idea than the notion of a basic income. And that was the idea of completely abolishing borders everywhere in the globe. Now, I haven't, seen the same enthusiasm from policymakers and political leaders for that idea, if you compare it to basic income. But it is interesting to think about, are borders really these natural phenomena that will always be with us? Or can we question them? I mean, if you look at the history of borders, up until say the late 19th century, it was fairly easy to travel around. Most countries didn't even issue passports, right? And the countries that did, like the Ottoman Empire or Russia, were considered backwards. This era in which we live now, which you could describe as globalized apartheid, right? Where the rich can travel around wherever they want, right? But the poor are often stuck in open air prisons. It wouldn't surprise me if the historians of the future will look back on our time and say, well, that was one of the greatest injustices of the 21st century. 60%, at least 60%, according to economists, of your income depends on, your just the country in which you live and in which you're allowed to work. It's one of the most gross violations of freedom that, a plumber from, say, Nigeria, who's really good at her work, can't come to the Netherlands and do that work for the salary that she could get for it here. I know there are many objections to immigration, and there are many difficulties, obviously. But I think we should never forget that in the fight against poverty, migration is the most powerful tool we have. I mean, there's just so many examples in history of that. And it's the one thing that economists from the left to the right agree on, right? Migration is the most powerful weapon to fight poverty. Just give people the opportunities to go where the opportunities are.
And yet, Rutger, it looks like, especially as you noted, right, in the last 2 decades, in the 21st century, we probably have many more barriers to movement, to freedom of movement, than even in the later half of the 20th century. I mean, it's more difficult today to move around, between countries than arguably in the 1990s. And in a sense, this kind of border condition that you're drawing our attention to, that also tends to make citizens within countries more precarious. I mean, in India, for instance, there are new citizenship acts, whose implications and consequences for current citizens are at the moment being debated. It's creating anxieties and uncertainties of various kinds. And the same can be reflected in many other parts of the world. So there is, as you noted, the coming up of walls, the building of anxieties. So how does this actually square up with the coming utopia?
Well, look, sometimes people describe me as an optimist, but I never really like the word optimism because it suggests a form of complacency to me, right? The optimists will tell you that we don't have to worry and things will turn out to be all right. It makes you lazy, right? And there are a lot of things right now happening in the world that I'm not particularly optimistic about. I mean, I mentioned climate change, obviously, the extinction of species. If we just look at how we treat animals today, I think that, life for humans has become much better in the last 200 years. If you look at the year 1800, around 3/4 of the world population was some kind of slave, in some kind of bondage to some other rich person. We've made tremendous progress in the fight against extreme poverty, child mortality, you name it, and that's absolutely wonderful. But then if you look at the lives of animals, it's become much worse. We slaughter 80 billion animals on an annual every year. And if you just realize that the amount of humans that ever lived is around 110 billion, just the scale of the industrial farming today is really quite horrifying. And again, it's a thing that I think historians of the future will look at with horror and say these people were absolute barbarians. Just like we can look at, say, the Romans or the ancient Aztecs or whatever, and look at, people who sacrificed other people or slavery of the past, etc. And then we are horrified. Well, probably the people in the future will be horrified by some of the things we do today as well. So long point short, we don't have to be an optimist. You don't have to be a pessimist as long as you're a possibilist, as long as you believe that things can be different. And that is, I think, the main lesson of history. Why history is the most exciting of all the social sciences, because it shows you that things do not have to be this way.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that it can change. And
Yeah.
that in itself is a very simple but profound insight, because so often when we watch the news, you know, when we follow daily politics, we constrain our imaginations and we tend to think, oh, it will always be this way. People often overestimate, I think, the amount of change that can happen in the next 2 or 3 years, but they vastly, radically underestimate the amount of change that can happen in the next 20 or 30 years. You know, it could be a completely different society, for the worse or for the better. And it's up to us. Yeah.
No, I want to come back to actually that question about the environment, later in our conversation. But I just want to return for the moment to this idea of optimism, because I can see that in both your books, I think you make the point that being cynicism is a kind of a lazy position. It is politically kind of naive, even in some ways, and that is something. Especially in among academics and intellectuals on the left, for instance, right? There's been a kind of a pride of place for the idea of the skeptic. Gramsci famously, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So why would you want to kind of give such a premium to an optimistic outlook, even when you're, what did you call it? Possibilist. Did you?
Yeah, or we can just use the simple term hope.
Right.
Let's choose hope over optimism. Hope is also about the possibility of change.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, let me just to push you on that. I mean, I was there's this highly anticipated new book by David Graeber that's supposed to be out any moment now, and one of the things that Graeber kind of observes is, and I've got that quote down here: the war against the imagination is the only one that the capitalists have actually managed to win, says Graeber. And he's trying, in this book, the Dawn of Everything, a new history of humanity, right? That in which Wengrow and Graeber, they're basically saying that something began to go terribly wrong, they say, in human history, and that was perhaps when people started losing the freedom to imagine and to enact other forms of social existence.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that? I mean, your books are both, I mean, clearly you are fellow travelers,
Yes.
But at the same time, your characterization of the place of ideas and what ideas can do is slightly at a tangent from many on the left. So why would that Keynesian position, if you will, about ideas changing the world, how would you kind of make a case for that?
I think where I'm a little bit different from many of those thinkers on the left is that I still like evolutionary anthropology. I still believe there is such a thing as human nature, and that we can study that and can make meaningful claims about it. There's a tendency, especially among left-wing anthropologists, to look at humans and see a blank slate, and just to emphasize the possibilities and say, well, anything is possible with humans. We're the kind of animals that can be anything, indeed, that the sky is the limit or our imagination is the limit, and that all kinds of different political configurations are possible, etc., etc. And this is, of course, true. We are a highly flexible species. But at the same time, I think we do have a nature, right? We have been shaped by evolutionary forces. We have lived for a very long time, you know, in a very tough environment in the Ice Age. And I think there is really exciting new research out there that I spent quite some time on in the book, around the self-domestication hypothesis. You know, the idea that we are domesticated apes, or that we are a product of what biologists now call survival of the friendliest. And there's nothing on that in David Graeber's and David Wengrow's book, because I think they sort of intuitively don't like evolutionary anthropology, because it's, I don't know, it suggests some stability in our history, that there were some evolutionary forces always present or something like that. And what I try to do in my book is to connect the fields of, you know, cultural anthropology and evolutionary anthropology. I mean, it's a wonderful book, and it's one of the great, you know, tragedies of last year that David Graeber passed away, because I think he's really one of the great thinkers of our time. Also, his book on bullshit jobs, by the way, is absolutely fantastic. Just makes you really rethink, who are the real wealth creators in our society? How have we ended up in this world where so many people do jobs that don't add anything of value, right? So many people just write reports and send emails to people they don't like. And how have we ended up there, where the people with the most sophisticated LinkedIn resumes earn the most money, went to the best universities, but still at the end of the day, they'll admit that their job is completely useless. So, yeah, I mean, anthropologists are great at that, really questioning those values and assumptions. But I think there are limits. I think we do have a nature. And my argument is that that nature is fundamentally playful and cooperative, and that we just yearn for friendliness and being part of a group and of something bigger. It could have been different, right? There are other animals in the animal kingdom that are quite different than us. And I think that this friendliness is actually the secret of our success. It's one of the ingredients that we need to look at if we want to explain why we have conquered the globe, and not the Neanderthals or any of the other hominid species that were around 50,000 years ago.
No, yeah, I mean, you know, certainly in your book, it's the kind of revisionist history of many of these experiments. You know, the way in which we had read The Lord of the Flies or the Stanford experiment. You know, and it's wonderful the way you revisit these particular moments and give us a different take on them. You know, but at the same time, I mean. I'm wondering how generative is the idea of essence itself. You know, why do we need to persist with this, asking the question, is there a fundamental essence to humanity? You know, because it tends to then become a bit of a zero-sum game, right? I mean, aren't we better off in acknowledging a certain kind of spectrum to goodness and badness, you know, and as you say, and very clearly in your own books, you do kind of also look at circumstances and the ways in which, in fact, you have a different interpretation of what those circumstances were that produced that particular kind of behavior, right? So that's where, you know, just to ask you, because we've been talking about the environment and global warming. It seems to me, if I were to ask you about the idea of the Anthropocene, right? This idea of an essential goodness in humanity strikes me as similar to the idea of species thinking. You know, the Anthropocene is responsible. So how would you kind of respond to the idea that, you know, it's not the Anthropocene that is responsible for global warming, but specific forms of and structures of societies, particular moments when particular interests actually created the mess that we are all now confronting.
So, you know, there was this moment in the 70s when a Chinese politician was asked what he thought of the French Revolution of 1789. And he famously responded, well, it's too early to tell. It's too early to say. We don't know yet. And I've always believed that we can say the same thing about civilization. Civilization, this thing that we came up with, I don't know, what is it, 10,000 years ago, when we started settling down and doing agriculture and started building villages and cities and invented the wheel and started writing, etc., etc. Usually this is seen as a wonderful thing, civilization. But if you zoom out a little bit, and if you, for example, compare the existence of a hunter-gatherer to the existence of a farmer for the biggest part of the history of civilization, well, if you're ever faced with the choice, do you want to be born as a hunter-gatherer or as a farmer? Well, I would certainly choose the former. It's much better to be a hunter-gatherer. Civilization was actually a complete disaster for most people for most of human history. It brought us wars, it brought us pandemics, it brought us the patriarchy, it brought us radical inequality, it brought us pollution, degradation of the environment, etc., etc., etc. Now, the strange thing is that the shape of human history you could say the shape of human history is very weird. Let's put it like that. So when you went to school, they told you, or at least me, that the shape of human history is like this. It's this steady march of progress. Life used to be very bad when life was nasty, brutish, and short, right? In the state of nature, as the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously said. But then gradually it became better as we became farmers, as we settled down, as we invented, all these kind of wonderful things. That's the story they told us, but it's a complete myth. I would say that if we want to describe the state of or the shape of history, it'd be more like this. So for 95% of our history, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers, and life was, well, not wonderful and quite tough sometimes, but relatively good. So we know that these societies were quite egalitarian, often described as fiercely egalitarian by anthropologists. We didn't have all these infection diseases yet. People were relatively healthy, right? A varied diet, bit of exercise. Anyway, that was what life was like. Then we invented civilization. It was a complete disaster, right? So again, pandemics, wars. There's now strong archaeological and anthropological evidence that war is actually quite a recent invention that started when people started accumulating power and started raising armies, etc. Around 10,000 years ago. So life was like this, then it became radically worse for, say, 10,000 years. And then just in the last 2 centuries, you see it shoot up like this, right? So that's sort of the last part of the graph. And so that's the very weird shape of human history. And then the question is, of course, how sustainable is it? How sustainable is our current wealth? That is, by the way, still very unequally distributed. But even those who are poor today in middle income countries or in rich countries are historically, by comparison, very rich. So I recently looked this up. If you're a homeless person in the Netherlands, where I live, you get an allowance of around, 500 euros a month. And that is, that means that you're part of the 15% richest of the population. So the homeless in the Netherlands are part of the 15% richest. If you have a median income in the Netherlands, you're part of the 3% richest of the world population. So this is often something that people forget, just how radically unequal the world still is. But then still, we have made a lot of progress, and that is something to be celebrated. We just don't know how sustainable it is. And it's also, we can't make historical comparisons because we've never been here before, right? So that's sometimes when I hear fellow historians or other people make comparisons to, say, the Roman Empire or, the decline of the Aztec Empire or whatever. I'm like, yeah, but all these comparisons don't work because society right today is so completely radically different. I mean, we may even be the only intelligent species in the whole universe, and this may be the first time this has ever happened, ever, right? So we have no clue. We are blind, stumbling forwards and taking extraordinary risks. That's the state we're in right now.
Absolutely. I mean, in a sense, that was what I was wanting to ask you from the point of view of a hopeful history.
Mm-hmm.
How would you rate our chances as far as the environmental crisis is concerned? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we are now in less than 48 hours, all the big leaders of the world are meeting in Glasgow,
Mm-hmm.
so COP26, and yet there doesn't seem to be that optimism. There doesn't seem to be a certain kind of all those David Cameron's been going on,
Mm-hmm.
other leaders have been going on about, but we seem to be kind of in a scenario where hope is in a corner, battling to actually make its kind of presence felt.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you assess how we, humanity, would respond to this clear and present danger?
Well, let me first say that we got to be realistic about the challenge of climate change, and it's really, really not looking good. So what we need to do is to completely transform our whole society and economy from the ground up, basically. And that will require sacrifices. It will cost a lot of money. It's not going to be nice for all of us. Obviously, rich countries need to go first. But yes, it will require sacrifices from all of us. And the political will is just not there right now. And not just among our political leaders, but also, if we're honest, if we look in the mirror, I mean, I've got a lot of friends, obviously, who are quite progressive and worried about climate change. But then, when I ask them, are you willing to make the necessary sacrifices, right? I mean, do you want, these solar panel farms everywhere? Do you want these very high windmills? Are you willing to consider nuclear energy, etc.? Then very quickly it becomes a more difficult conversation. So environmentalists today often like to make the comparison to the Second World War, right? When the United States and also the United Kingdom had this very impressive mobilization. And often climate change is compared to that. It's that we need to do the same thing as the Allied powers did during the Second World War. Radically transform their economy, produce as many tanks, bombs, and grenades as possible. The only difference this time is that we need to build as many, solar panels and windmills and nuclear plants, etc., as quickly as possible. What they don't tell you, though, is what mobilization looked like in practice. So, I mean, as a historian, I was, of course, fascinated by this question. So I started, reading quite a bit about it. And then what you discover is that mobilization meant severe restriction of civil liberties, incredibly high taxation, and not just on the rich, but on everyone. You can buy a lot of consumer products anymore. There was something called victory speed, so you could only go 35 miles an hour on the road. It really meant very significant sacrifices. And then here the case is, the question is, are we willing to make those sacrifices? I think that is really what is necessary. We need the kind of political leaders today who won't tell us fairy tales about everything is going to be wonderful. The economy will grow. We'll have more innovation. You'll get a basic income. You'll get a 15-hour work week. Everything is going to be awesome and wonderful, and we'll solve climate change at the same time. That's not the reality. The reality is that we are in an emergency, and in an emergency, everyone has got to do things that they rather not. Can we do this? Well, in the book, I've got a little tale about Easter Island, this island in the middle of the Pacific. And for a long time, it was seen as an example of how humans can commit ecocide, completely destroy their environment and wreck the future, basically. You have all these bizarre statues, right? People will know these, that they build on Easter Island. So the standard story was that they became obsessed with building these weird, huge statues that in order to produce and transport them, they had to cut all the trees on the island. And when the forest on the island was gone, they got soil erosion, They couldn't, do agriculture anymore. And so hunger broke out, civil war, cannibalism, end of civilization. That's the standard story of Easter Island. Now, why did I want to write about it? Because modern archaeologists and anthropologists look at Easter Island in a completely different way. We now know that actually these trees were not dying because of, humans who were gone nuts and were obsessed with building these statues. No, it was a plague of rats who were chewing the seeds, of the tree. So that's bad luck. But even after the forest was gone, humans adapted. Right? These people were incredibly resilient, and they came up with new ways of doing agriculture that were actually more productive. So what was the real story of Easter Island is that this was a relatively healthy, thriving population. Indeed, the first person who sort of discovered Easter Island, or the first European who arrived there, was a man named Roggeveen, a Dutch captain. And indeed, in his journal, he describes that these people were relatively healthy and quite peaceful and friendly, etc. Then what happened? Well, the Europeans, that's what happened. They brought pandemics and war and slavery, etc. And that's what destroyed the Easter Island civilization. Before that, what's really striking about it is this extraordinary adaptiveness and resilience. And that is a central part of human nature, I'd say. And it's something we desperately need today. And I see some hope there, is that history teaches us that when things get tough, we do not, panic and become these selfish monsters. No, we adapt and try to cooperate and work together. At least that's what most of us do. Obviously, there are many examples to the contrary. But I think that if you zoom out a little bit, the vast majority of people cooperate in times of crisis.
So would you then say, Rutger, that one of the implications of your work seems to be that human beings can get perfectly well with each other without, let us say, having governments or institutions? Would you subscribe to that sense of humans being so inherently good that they look out for each other, they can build communities on their own without the need for regulation, oversight?
Well, that's, of course, what the anarchists have been saying for a very long time. And of all of the political ideologies, anarchism has, I think, been the most ineffective, right? But at the same time, I think that anarchism is also the most scientifically correct theory of human nature. What do the anarchists tell us? Well, they tell us, I think, two things. They tell us that most people are pretty decent, but that power corrupts. And there's an extraordinary amount of scientific evidence, to back up those two claims. Indeed, most people are pretty decent. We have evolved to cooperate. We are a product of what you could call survival of the friendliest. For millennia, when we lived as hunter-gatherers, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids and had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. And the evidence for that is still in our own genes today, and it is in our own bodies today, in the design of our own bodies today. We are the only animal in the whole animal kingdom with the ability to blush. It's pretty extraordinary. We involuntarily give away our feelings to other members, of our species, which helps us to cooperate. We're also the only animal among primates with white in our eyes, right? So people can see that now I'm looking in the camera, now I'm looking to the left, now I'm looking to the right. They can track my gaze. If I was a chimpanzee, wouldn't have been possible, right? Because chimpanzees, they've got dark sclera, as they call it, which makes it more difficult to track their gazes. They're a little bit like poker players wearing shades, right? Doesn't really help to establish trust. So that is in our biological design, right? You could say, and anarchists have been saying it for a very long time. Kropotkin, the famous Russian anarchist, wrote this book called Mutual Aid, published, I think in 1902, where he already made the case that, evolutionary theory should be much more about cooperation than just about competition, especially when we talk about humans. Now, obviously, the tragedy of the anarchists is that they're not very good at building institutions. And institutions are what rule the world, right? It's how we design our democracies, our workplaces, our prisons, etc. That's what really determines human behavior in the end. And because anarchists are so wary of power because they know power corrupts, they run the risk of standing on the sidelines, forever complaining about, oh, there are so many other possibilities that we don't explore. But yeah, at some point, you got to get your hands dirty and think about how are you going to actually reform these institutions if you want to change human behavior. So that is what I've been thinking about a lot in the past couple of years. Can we build a state on anarchist principles? I know that sounds nuts, but but what I think it would mean in practice is to build all kinds of institutions that are founded on this assumption that human beings are naturally creative, playful, decent creatures. And in the second half of my book, Humankind, I try to give a lot of examples of organizations that do that, of a criminal justice system that does that. And I talk about how they treat prisoners in Norway, where they treat prisoners as actual human beings, and they've actually achieved the lowest recidivism rate in the whole world, the lowest chance that someone will commit another crime once he or she gets out of prison. But I'm very conscious of the fact that in that part of the book, I only, look at, maybe 1% of the possibilities. Because once you change your view of human nature and try to start implementing it in your institutional designs, everything changes. And that's what the anarchists need to become much better at. Not just, critiquing power from the sidelines, but also thinking much harder about how do you actually scale up? How do you move from Occupy Wall Street to winning and radically changing the world?
No, I think that's a very productive set of criticisms, actually. Rutger, actually, we can go on and on, but I'm conscious of the fact that we are running a little bit out of time, and there are a bunch of audience questions I have out here. I most certainly will not be able to take all, but let me at least try and see if we can push in a couple. So there's Anjana George who asks, your works have attracted considerable criticism, especially the charge that you cherry pick your evidence to suit your thesis and simply ignore facts that undermine your assertions. The Lord of the Flies example, for instance, how do you respond to your critics?
Well, the chapter about Lord of the Flies is obviously just an anecdote. It's just a story. It doesn't prove anything. The reason I include it in the book is that we humans, we become the stories that we tell ourselves, right? We are fundamentally a storytelling species. And the fictional Lord of the Flies has been so influential for such a long time. Millions of children around the globe were basically forced to read this very cynical story about how kids would behave in a horrible way once they end up on an uninhabited island. So I thought it should be good if people know that it actually happened once in all of human history. And the real Lord of the Flies is a very different kind of story. Now, obviously, what you need to do is also to zoom out, right? So that's why in the book, whenever I talk about a certain scientific discipline, I try to look at meta-analyses as much as possible. So meta-analyses are studies of studies, right? Where they look at what is the consensus in a certain field, which direction are most of the studies pointing? Because as we all know, one study is no study, right? You really have to look at what are the broader findings. And then what I also kept in mind all this time while I was writing this book was a simple question. Will this hold up 10 years from now? Can I still publish this book 10 years from now? And that really influences your writing process, because there are a lot of studies out there that, fit my thesis, and it was very, tempting to include them. And then you got to force yourself, well, maybe not, because, maybe it's now an interesting paper in Science or Nature, two of the most important scientific journals, but maybe it won't be replicated. So whether it's about the bystander effect, on which I have a chapter, or contact theory, on which I have a chapter, all these psychological theories are grounded, I think, in a lot of studies. And I think, we'd have to do this conversation again 10 years from now, but I think they will hold up. It's actually interesting. If you want to write a book like this, you start relying much more on all the theories and all the ideas. So contact theory, for example, on which I have a whole chapter, it's a simple idea that if you bring people together, let them meet each other, talk to each other, that is the best medicine you have against hate, racism, and prejudice. Well, the theory goes back to the 1950s. We've got hundreds and hundreds of studies that show that it's probably correct. Yeah, you become a little bit more old-fashioned, right? Scientifically old-fashioned. Because of obviously time is the best test, right? To see whether something really holds up.
Wonderful. Rutger Bregman, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We are completely out of time, but
yeah, sorry for giving much too long answers, but you're asking such interesting questions, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah, it's been.
This is always my. There's a problem with historians in general. They can't give short answers.
That's right. That's right. But it's been very engaging, and I must say, as your YouTube videos show, clearly you are a wonderful communicator. It's been wonderful to speak with you, and look forward to reading many of your books in the coming time.
Thank you. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to our speakers for this fascinating session. Thanks to our lovely audience for joining us today. A big thank you to our title sponsor Tata and co-sponsors Tata Steel and Tata Projects, along with Godrej, and our session sponsor Kotak.